Before the walls fell, before the battles began, before anyone drew a sword, the real weapon of ancient warfare had already been deployed: hunger. A city under siege didn't collapse in days or weeks. It died slowly, system by system, as the invisible machinery of survival ground to a halt. The water cisterns that had taken generations to carve into bedrock became breeding grounds for disease. The grain stores that represented years of careful taxation and storage began to dwindle. The latrine systems that had kept thousands alive now threatened to poison everyone inside the walls. This is the story of what happened when the supply lines stopped, when the gates closed, and when survival became an engineering problem with no good answers. Most people imagine ancient sieges as dramatic military events, all battering rams and flaming arrows. But the archaeological record tells a different story. The real battle wasn't fought on the walls. It was fought in the alleyways where water had to be rationed, in the homes where families decided which child would eat that day, in the underground passages where city officials tried desperately to keep the infrastructure from collapsing entirely. Historians estimate that for every person who died from violence during a siege, 10 died from starvation, disease, or the complete breakdown of urban systems. Let's start with the most critical system, the one that would fail first: water. In the ancient Near East, cities weren't built where water was abundant. They were built where defense was possible. Jerusalem sat on a ridge, easily defensible, but with one catastrophic weakness. The primary water source, the Gihon Spring, was outside the city walls. King Hezekiah understood this vulnerability around 700 BCE, and archaeological excavations by Kathleen Kenyon and later teams have revealed his solution: a tunnel carved through 1,700 feet of solid bedrock, redirecting the spring water into the city through the Siloam Pool. The tunnel still exists today, and engineers marvel at the precision. Two teams of workers carved from opposite ends, meeting in the middle with only inches of deviation. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. This tunnel took years to complete, used technology that barely existed, and represented one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in ancient history. During a siege, that tunnel became everything. It was the difference between 3 months of survival and 3 weeks. But water management during a siege wasn't just about having a source. It was about rationing, about preventing contamination, about keeping thousands of people alive on a supply that would normally support half that number. Archaeological evidence from besieged cities across the ancient world shows the same pattern. Massive underground cisterns, sometimes carved 50 feet into limestone, plastered with waterproof lime to prevent seepage. In Jerusalem alone, researchers have identified hundreds of these cisterns. But during a siege, these became mathematically grim. A human needs roughly a gallon of water per day just for drinking. Add cooking, minimal sanitation, and you're looking at 2 gallons per person daily. A cistern holding 10,000 gallons sounds impressive until you do the math. That's 5,000 person days, or about 2 weeks for a population of 300. Cities survived longer sieges only through brutal rationing. Women would line up before dawn, receiving measured portions in pottery vessels. Guards would stand watch at every cistern entrance. The archaeological record shows that some cisterns were deliberately collapsed during sieges, likely to prevent enemies from poisoning them if the walls were breached. Now, consider what happens to sanitation when a city goes into lockdown. In normal times, ancient cities like Jerusalem had sophisticated waste management. Excavations have revealed stone-cut drainage channels running beneath the streets, some large enough for a person to crawl through for maintenance. These channels carried rainwater and waste down the Kidron Valley, away from the living areas. But during a siege, these systems faced impossible loads. The population inside the walls would swell as rural families fled to the fortified city. Suddenly, infrastructure designed for 10,000 people had to handle 15 or 20,000. The drainage systems would overflow. Waste would accumulate in the streets. And here's the brutal truth that ancient sources hint at, but rarely state directly. During extended sieges, cities began to smell like mass graves before anyone had actually died. The stench of human waste, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies, packed into tight quarters, would have been overwhelming. Josephus, describing the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, mentions that the smell from the city could be detected from the Roman camps outside the walls. That wasn't metaphorical, that was a public health crisis playing out in real time. Food storage and distribution became the next critical system to collapse. Under normal circumstances, ancient cities maintained granaries, large storage facilities filled during harvest season to supply the urban population year-round. The biblical account mentions Joseph's storage cities in Egypt, and archaeological excavations have confirmed these weren't small operations. At sites like Megiddo and Hazor, researchers have uncovered massive storage pits, some over 20 feet deep, capable of holding hundreds of tons of grain. But siege warfare turned this abundance into a countdown clock. Let's do the mathematics of starvation. An adult needs roughly 1,500 calories daily to avoid malnutrition. Grain provides about 1,600 calories per pound, so each person requires roughly a pound of grain per day, minimum. A city of 10,000 people needs 5 tons of grain daily. For a 6-month siege, that's 900 tons. And that's assuming people are eating at subsistence levels with nothing else, no protein, no vegetables, no variation at all. The reality was worse because grain storage has a failure rate. Even in the best conditions, ancient storage methods would lose 10 to 15% of grain to moisture, rodents, and insects annually. During a siege, when those storage facilities couldn't be properly maintained and aired out, that loss rate would increase. Archaeological evidence from siege contexts shows increased rodent remains, suggesting that rats became a major problem when the usual predators, the city's cats and dogs, were themselves being eaten. The biblical account of the siege of Samaria in 2 Kings chapter 6 describes conditions so desperate that people were eating donkey heads and dove droppings. Modern historians debate whether these are literal or metaphorical descriptions, but the archaeological evidence from other besieged cities suggests these accounts aren't exaggerated. Excavations at Lachish, destroyed by the Assyrian siege around 700 BCE, revealed evidence of severe malnutrition in the human remains, including bone markers that indicate prolonged starvation, particularly among children and the elderly. But food distribution during a siege wasn't just about scarcity, it was about power. Someone had to control the remaining supplies, decide who ate and who didn't, manage the gradual transition from abundance to survival rations to starvation. In ancient monarchies, this control typically fell to the king and his officials. The biblical text mentions that during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, King Hezekiah and his officials maintained control of the food stores. Jeremiah chapter 37 describes officials who clearly had better access to food than the general population. This wasn't unusual. Across ancient siege contexts, elites ate longer and better than commoners. It's a brutal calculus, but from a leadership perspective, it made sense. You needed your soldiers strong enough to defend the walls, your officials clear-headed enough to manage the crisis, your craftsmen capable enough to repair siege damage. So the food went to them first, then to their families, and only then, if anything remained, to the general population. The psychological toll of watching this system break down must have been extraordinary. Imagine being a mother in a besieged city, watching your food ration shrink week by week, knowing that somewhere in the city storage rooms still hold grain, but you're told it's reserved for the soldiers. Imagine the social fabric tearing as neighbors begin to suspect each other of hoarding, as families make impossible decisions about who gets the last piece of bread. The biblical account of the siege of Samaria includes a horrifying story of 2 women who agree to eat their children, a detail so disturbing that many modern readers assume it must be exaggeration. But anthropological studies of siege conditions throughout history, from ancient times to modern conflicts, show that such extremes do occur when starvation reaches critical levels. The human body, deprived of calories, enters a state where the brain's normal ethical processing begins to malfunction. People make decisions they would never make under normal circumstances, not because they're evil, but because their biochemistry is literally failing. Beyond water, sanitation, and food, consider the medical systems that would collapse during a siege. In normal times, ancient cities had some form of healthcare, not hospitals in the modern sense, but practitioners who understood wound treatment, herbal remedies, basic surgery. During a siege, these practitioners faced impossible conditions. Injuries from defensive fighting would increase. Malnutrition would make wounds heal slower and infections more likely. crowded conditions would spread disease rapidly, and most critically, the supply lines for medical materials would be cut. Ancient medicine relied heavily on imported ingredients. Egyptian natron for wound treatment, spices and resins from Arabia and Mesopotamia for various remedies, minerals that had to be traded from distant regions. When the siege began, whatever medical supplies existed in the city were all you had. Archaeological evidence from ancient pharmacies and storage areas shows that medical practitioners stockpiled materials, but in a siege lasting months, those supplies would run out. Then you're left with only local plants and whatever could be improvised. The psychological warfare of siege conditions extended beyond just fear of the enemy outside. It was the daily grind of declining conditions inside. Historians studying siege accounts note that the first weeks of a siege often saw high morale. People believed relief would come, that the siege would be lifted, that their suffering would be temporary. But as weeks turned to months, as children began to show signs of malnutrition, as the death rate from disease increased, that morale would crack. The biblical prophets, particularly Jeremiah, described this psychological decline. His prophecies weren't just spiritual warnings, they were observations of a society under extreme stress, fragmenting and turning on itself. Jeremiah chapter 38 describes officials so desperate and angry that they throw the prophet into a cistern, essentially trying to kill him, not because of theological disagreement, but because his message of surrender threatened their entire worldview. They'd committed to resistance, invested everything in the belief that God would deliver them, and anyone suggesting otherwise became an existential threat. Let's talk about the decision-making process during a siege, because this reveals something profound about human nature under pressure. When should a city surrender? From a purely practical standpoint, the answer is clear. Before conditions become catastrophic, before starvation sets in, before disease spreads. But ancient cities rarely surrendered early. Why? Because surrender meant uncertainty. You didn't know if the enemy would honor terms, if they'd enslave the population, if they'd destroy the city anyway. So cities held out, hoping for relief, hoping for a miracle, hoping the enemy would give up first. This calculation appears repeatedly in ancient sources. Josephus describes the factions inside Jerusalem during the Roman siege arguing about surrender terms, even as people were dying of starvation in the streets. The archaeological record supports this pattern of delayed surrender. Cities show evidence of defending until conditions were utterly catastrophic, until the walls were breached and resistance became impossible. The engineering of siege defense itself deserves examination, because this was the one area where besieged cities could still act, could still fight back against the grinding inevitability of starvation. Archaeological evidence shows that cities under siege would frantically strengthen defenses, build secondary walls, dig deeper cisterns, create hidden passages for sorties against the enemy. The biblical account of Hezekiah's preparations before the Assyrian siege includes strengthening the walls, building towers, and creating that crucial water tunnel. These weren't ceremonial projects. They were desperate attempts to buy time, to make the siege so costly for the attacker that they'd give up before the city's systems completely failed. Some of these defensive works were remarkably sophisticated. At Lachish, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a double wall system with towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. The defenders had calculated sight lines, built the walls at angles that made battering rams less effective, created kill zones where attackers would be exposed to missile fire from multiple directions. But here's the terrible irony. All these defensive improvements required resources, labor, materials that were also needed for survival. Building a secondary wall meant diverting workers from farming or food distribution. Creating new cisterns meant using lime and labor that could have been used elsewhere. It was a brutal calculation with no good answers. Defend better now but have less food later, or conserve resources but make the city easier to capture. Ancient kings and their advisors had to make these decisions, knowing that either choice could lead to disaster. The biblical text rarely dwells on these practical dilemmas, but they're implicit in every siege account. When 2 Kings chapter 25 says the famine was severe in the city, that's not just description. That's the end result of years of preparing for this moment, of making choices about resources, of trying to balance military necessity against human survival. The experience of living through a siege would have created trauma that lasted generations. Children who grew up during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem would have carried those memories for life. The constant hunger, watching friends and family die, the smell of death in the streets. The moment the walls finally fell and the world they knew ended. These weren't abstract historical events. They were lived experiences that shaped identities and communities. When you read the biblical laments about Jerusalem's destruction, remember that these were written by survivors who had endured months of deteriorating conditions, who had made impossible choices, who had watched their city's systems fail one by one until nothing remained. The poetry of Lamentations isn't just theological reflection. It's trauma literature, an attempt to process horror that defied normal comprehension. And here's what makes the faith of these survivors so remarkable. They didn't abandon their beliefs despite watching every system fail. The priests in Jerusalem kept offering sacrifices even as food supplies dwindled, even when it made no practical sense to burn grain as an offering when people were starving. The prophets kept proclaiming messages of hope even when the evidence suggested no hope remained. This wasn't foolishness or denial. It was a refusal to let the collapse of physical systems destroy the meaning system that gave their suffering purpose. When you understand the engineering and logistics, when you grasp how completely everything fell apart, the persistence of faith becomes even more striking. These weren't people living in comfortable delusion. They were people watching their civilization die in real time and choosing to believe that somehow, beyond the visible catastrophe, there was still meaning and purpose. Modern readers often skip past the siege narratives quickly, treating them as brief historical notes between the more interesting spiritual lessons. But the people who lived through these events couldn't skip past anything. For them, the siege was measured in incremental degradations of normal life. Each day slightly worse than the last, each week bringing new impossibilities. The woman who had cooked 3 meals a day for her family now cooked one, then one every other day, then found herself with nothing to cook at all. The merchant who had traded goods across the region now had nothing to trade and no one to trade with. The priest who had maintained elaborate rituals now struggled to find oil for the lamps, flour for the offerings, any way to maintain continuity with the world that existed before the siege began. So what kept cities fighting even when logic said surrender? Part of it was faith, certainly. The belief that God would intervene, that deliverance would come, that the suffering had purpose. But part of it was also the simple human inability to accept that the world you've known is ending. Historians call this normalcy bias, the tendency to believe that things will return to normal even when all evidence suggests otherwise. During the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, right up until the walls were breached, people continued some semblance of normal life. They traded in the markets, even though there was less and less to trade. They maintained social structures even as those structures were clearly failing. They clung to routine because routine was all they had left. The biblical text captures this in small details, the way it mentions specific people, specific transactions, specific moments of ordinary life continuing even as the city died around them. The question of how people survived ancient sieges has no simple answer, because many didn't survive. The archaeological evidence is clear on this point. Siege layers in ancient cities show mass burials, burn layers, evidence of violent destruction. But some did survive, and their survival required more than just luck. It required communities sharing resources when everything pushed toward hoarding. It required leaders making brutal but rational decisions about rationing. It required engineers maintaining water systems under impossible conditions. It required ordinary people finding ways to endure what should have been unendurable. The hidden system of siege survival wasn't technological, though technology mattered. It was social, a web of obligations and relationships and shared purpose that held together even as everything else fell apart. When you read the prophets railing against social injustice, against the rich oppressing the poor, against officials enriching themselves, remember that these dynamics became life and death matters during a siege. A society that had maintained some equity, some sense of shared obligation, had a better chance of surviving the stress test of siege warfare. A society where the elite had already extracted everything they could from the poor, where trust had eroded, where social bonds had weakened, that society would fragment faster under pressure. The prophets weren't just making moral arguments. They were diagnosing the structural weaknesses that would determine who lived and who died when the crisis came. And the crisis always came. In the ancient Near East, with its competing empires and shifting alliances, siege warfare wasn't an if, but a when. Every city knew that someday the gates would close and the test would begin. The systems we've explored, the water management, the food storage, the social structures, all of it existed in anticipation of that moment. The remarkable thing isn't that these systems sometimes failed. The remarkable thing is that they sometimes succeeded, that cities held out for months or even years, that communities under unimaginable stress found ways to maintain cohesion and purpose. The hidden system of siege survival was ultimately about what humans can endure when they have to, about the engineering of not just cisterns and walls, but of hope itself. The next time you encounter a siege narrative in ancient texts, ask yourself, what did the morning routine look like for someone inside those walls? How did they decide who got water that day? What conversation happened in homes when the food ration was cut again? What sounds filled the streets? What smells? What daily indignities? The answers reveal a kind of courage that's easy to miss if you're focused only on the dramatic moments, the battles and prophecies and theological significance. But the real story of ancient sieges was written in the mundane struggle to keep the invisible machinery of survival running one more day, to maintain humanity when everything pushed toward its loss, to believe in tomorrow when today offered no rational reason for hope. What other invisible systems shaped the world of the Bible, systems so fundamental that the ancient writers barely mentioned them because everyone already understood? That's the question we'll explore next time, when we examine the engineering that made the temple possible and the economy that kept it running. The hidden systems of siege survival reveal something profound. Faith wasn't just tested in moments of crisis, it was sustained by communities who engineered hope into their daily routines, even as everything collapsed around them. These weren't abstract theological exercises, they were lived realities of impossible choices and desperate ingenuity. Thanks for watching this exploration of how ancient cities actually survived under siege. If this look behind the curtain of biblical history intrigued you, join us next time as we step inside the temple itself. We're going to follow the money, track the logistics of thousands of daily sacrifices, and reveal the economic machine that made the temple system possible. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the beating heart of an entire economy, and the engineering required to keep it running will surprise you. Next episode, Inside the Temple System, Priests, Sacrifices, and the Money Flow. Before you go, leave a comment answering this. If you were a city official during an ancient siege, would you enforce equal rationing for everyone, knowing it might mean losing your best soldiers and craftsmen? Or would you implement tiered rationing that gave elites better access to food? There's no easy answer, and I want to hear how you'd navigate that impossible choice.